Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Kolb's experiential learning cycle. We have talked about it quite a bit or mentioned it quite a lot, I should say, in the handout and on the website. And the reason that we put such an emphasis on it is because it's one of the most profound things that I've learned from the educational psychologist and instructional designer who has been helping us build this program. The reason I place such an emphasis on the fact that we use this learning cycle model in the program is because what I see a lot of in not just our profession, but in a lot of professions is this perceived war between the book learners and the, hands-on experience people. And there's kind of a lot of disparaging talk between the two. Like, it's great that you have your head in the books, but I'm on the ground actually training dogs, that kind of stuff. And then on the other end, it's like, that's cool that you can handle a leash, but do you even know why that works? It's really important for you to know stuff. And the thing that's kind of silly about that war is that you actually need not just those two things, but all four parts of the cycle to become really competent at any skill. So I think it's really important to have that discussion and say, look, we are going to give you hands-on experience. And yes, we're going to give you the theory as well. But those are only two of the four components of successful and thorough learning. And the other two are practicing in a safe environment where you're not actually putting anybody at risk, which is one of the biggest problems with just throwing people in and doing hands-on, on the job training, is that if you don't know what you're doing, you're cutting your chops at the risk of an actual sentient being. So they're the ones who are having to bear the brunt of your mistakes. And that's really sketchy in terms of ethics, right? But also, we need to have some kind of self-evaluation or objective assessment of what we just did and what we need to do to continue improving. And I think that's lacking a lot, especially because our school system and a lot of programs are built on a model of grading people and giving people scores. And I don't think that's a particularly helpful way to teach or to learn, because it doesn't necessarily tell you what you can improve on. It's just like, nah, you got that stuff wrong. You're a C student now. And also, there's a lot of emotions that are attached to those grades, which are really detrimental. If you're succeeding and you get straight A's, then getting anything less than a straight A can be devastating, and then there's this enormous pressure and anxiety to continue to get those A's. And if you get less than A's, then you have this perception of yourself as being stupid or dumb or not a good learner. And that's where a lot of these escape avoidance behaviors happen, where people are like, I'm not a school person, I'm a hands-on person. And that's really not helpful in terms of looking at your own learning journey, or in terms of how you feel about learning. It creates this atmosphere of mistakes are bad, and instead of thinking of them as opportunities to continue learning and just a natural part of the process. So I think it's really important to learn how to objectively assess what you've done without those emotions attached to them, and without this kind of feeling of I failed, or I'm not getting it right, or I'm stupid, or I have to stay perfect, or anything like that. So understanding that all four of those components are just a normal expected part of the learning process, and you're not going to get things perfect. And that didn't sound like grammar, did it? Oh, well, who cares? That was so meta. You're not going to get things perfect, including using grammar when you talk, for example. You will do things imperfectly, and that's not only okay, but it's expected and it's normal and it's appropriate. So what we want people to care about when they're learning is understanding that all 4 components are important, but also recognizing your preference and embracing that. So yes, you need all 4 components. You need the hands-on experience, you need the theory, you need the experimental practice, and you need the objective assessment. But you get to choose where you enter that learning journey. And that, I think, is a really important component of the mentorship program as well. We wanted to design it so that you can kind of jump in wherever you want and move through the cycle wherever you want, right? However you want to. So I think the other thing that's important to bring up here is that one of the reasons that we decided to really start from the beginning and have everybody go through the whole program, which I'll talk about more in a later unit, is that a lot of times when people have learned the sort of basics in the past, again, the way that we learn things, or the way that in at least this country we teach things, sort of we have all these emotional attachments to the things that we have learned, which is not necessarily a bad thing, as long as we're aware of it and we can sort of step outside of it. But one of the things that we see in this profession, and one of the reasons that we want people to go all the way through the program, is that there's some confusion about the difference between terminology and jargon. And so a lot of times we hear people say, I am a hands-on learner because I don't care about terminology. I think it's confusing. And when that's your position, what you don't realize is that you can't not learn terminology and jargon. And the problem with not learning it correctly is that you can't tell the difference between terminology and jargon. And that influences how you think, which then influences how you train, which then influences your outcomes, which then influences your perception about those outcomes. So it seems like a little hair-splitty, nitpicky thing to care about, but in reality, this is the crux of a lot of the conflict and a lot of the difficulties that we're seeing in our profession. So yeah, you kind of do have to learn terminology, whether or not you want to, or whether or not you think it's valuable. It is really important to know what words mean and what the definitions are, and whether they're actually scientific terminology or whether it's just jargon. So a really good example of that, the difference, first let me say what the difference is. The difference between terminology and jargon is that terminology refers to words or phrases that are an agreed upon standard within any academic field. So every academic field has its own terminology, which in unit 0.2, we'll talk about how that muddies the waters for us as behavior consultants. But for now, terminology is what it is. You can't, it's not like it's up to everybody's different perceptions, like to each their own. Like, no, that's not how it works. This entire academic field has agreed upon what these words mean. And you can't just kind of like slap your own definition on it and call it a day, right? Jargon is agreed upon words within a specific profession or community or counterculture, subcommunity of any kind. And a lot of times, jargon can be a little bit misleading when we're throwing terminology, when we're mixing up terminology and jargon. So now I'll get back to where I originally started. One of the examples of this that we encounter a lot in our profession and in parallel professions is the use of the term quadrants. And this has kind of become a pet peeve for me because I experienced firsthand and have seen quite a bit in our profession about how a lot of conflict and labeling has arisen because trainers believe that the word quadrants is scientific terminology, but quadrants is dog trainer jargon, and it refers to 4 operant consequences that people frequently talk about incorrectly. And what happens is, and we think that all of operant behavior falls into this neat little tidy box of only 4 possible outcomes. And then so what happens then is everybody starts arguing about the quadrants, which ones you can use and which ones you can't. And I think we should use them all. Well, that's not an accurate way to look at or think about behavior. It's not the way that behavior analysts think about or talk about behavior. And then this idea of quadrants is really simplifying and limiting. So that is a really good example of how when you don't learn the terminology, or you don't learn accurate terminology, then you can conflate terminology for jargon, and then it can create a lot of problems, not just in how you think about behavior and how you approach behavior, but in how you interact with other colleagues and the conflict that can arise from that. So this is why we keep hammering on Kolb's experiential learning cycle, and why we bring it up so often, and why it's such an important part of the mentorship program. Because if we want to be competent, confident, ethical, compassionate behavior professionals, we have to have all 4 of those components: hands-on practice, theoretical learning, experimental practice, or experiential practice, and then of course the objective assessment. Okay, that's it for this topic. We're ready to move on. I'll see you in the next segment. Bye.